"The wedding continues," he said, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the funeral parlor like a blade through black silk. Margaret Collins stood frozen, her travel-worn dress clinging to her trembling frame, the wedding bouquet she'd carried 3,000 miles now wilting in her white-knuckled grip. The man before her shared the same piercing blue eyes as the corpse lying in the mahogany casket, but where death had claimed Thomas Whitmore, life burned fierce and uncompromising in his older brother's gaze. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The scent of lily and embalming fluid hung heavy in the stifling Montana air, mixing with the dust that coated everything in this godforsaken frontier town of Copper Ridge. Margaret's stomach lurched as she stared at the face of the man she'd traveled from Boston to marry, a face now waxy and still, bearing no resemblance to the kind smile in the photograph he'd sent 6 months ago. She had stepped off the morning train just 2 hours earlier, her heart hammering with nervous excitement and the weight of her desperate circumstances. The conductor had helped her down onto the wooden platform, her single battered trunk containing everything she owned in the world. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street, so different from the cobblestones and brick buildings of her Boston neighborhood. Margaret had clutched Thomas's letter in her gloved hand, the paper soft from countless readings. During the long journey west, his words had promised safety, respectability, a chance at the kind of life that had been ripped away from her when the textile mill closed and her father's debts came due. "Dear Miss Collins," the letter had begun. "In careful script, I am a man of modest means but honest work, seeking a wife of good character to share in building a life in God's country." Those words had been her lifeline when the landlord came knocking, when her younger sister Emma needed medicine they couldn't afford, when the choice became clear, marriage to a stranger or destitution on the streets of Boston. She'd written back with trembling hands, enclosing the only photograph she owned, a formal portrait taken for her 18th birthday. When times were still good, the correspondence had continued for months. Thomas wrote of his cattle ranch, of the wide-open spaces where a person could breathe free, of Sunday services in the small wooden church where neighbors were family. He'd seemed gentle in his letters, speaking of building a garden together, of children who might run through fields under endless sky. Never once had he written with the crude urgency that characterized so many men seeking mail-order brides. He'd spoken of partnership, of companionship, of growing old together watching sunsets paint the mountains gold. But Thomas Whitmore would never see another sunset. Margaret's knees threatened to buckle as the reality crashed over her like a cold Atlantic wave. The train ticket back to Boston would cost money she didn't have. Even if she could scrape together the fare, what waited for her there? Emma had written that she'd found work in a laundry, barely earning enough to keep their tiny rented room. There was no place for Margaret in that life anymore. She'd burned those bridges when she'd accepted Thomas's proposal and sold what little furniture they owned to buy her wedding dress. The dress. Margaret looked down at the cream-colored wool she'd stitched by lamplight through long summer nights, every careful seam a prayer for the future. She'd used the last of her mother's pearl buttons, saved since childhood, and trimmed the cuffs with lace made from thread she'd bought with money meant for food. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned, and now it felt like a costume for a play that had ended before the curtain rose. "Ma'am." The undertaker's voice startled her from her spiraling thoughts. He was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers who kept glancing toward the door as if expecting trouble. "The service needs to begin. Folks are waiting." Margaret turned to see the small congregation that had gathered. Weather-beaten ranchers holding their hats in calloused hands, their wives in simple dark dresses, children fidgeting in the back pews. These were the people who had known Thomas, who had been expecting to welcome her as his bride. Instead, they stared at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands. She caught fragments of their conversations. Poor thing, came all this way ... What's she gonna do now? Shame about Thomas, but that's cattle. Country for you ... Heard it was rustlers that got him. Rustlers. The word sent ice through Margaret's veins. Thomas had died violently, gunned down while protecting his herd from thieves who had plagued the territory all summer. The sheriff had caught them 2 days later, but Thomas was already buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking his ranch. The brother who now stood before her had arranged everything, had even paid for the headstone. You must be Margaret. His voice was deeper than Thomas's had been in their brief conversation at the train station before the terrible news was delivered. Where Thomas had been slight and scholarly, he'd taught school. Before saving enough to buy his ranch, this man was built like the mountains themselves. Broad shoulders strained against a black wool coat, and his hands looked like they could break granite or gentle a spooked horse with equal ease. I'm Samuel Whitmore, Sam. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of prairie wheat in late summer. I'm sorry you had to learn about Thomas this way. I sent a telegram to Boston. But you'd already left. Margaret's throat closed. She'd been traveling for 4 days, changing trains in Chicago, sleeping fitfully in hard seats while the landscape transformed from familiar forests to endless grassland. All that time, she'd been dreaming of her new life while Thomas lay cold in his grave. I don't understand. The words came out as barely a whisper. The wedding continues? What do you mean? Sam's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or determination. Thomas wrote to me about you, about your situation back east, about how you needed ... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. About how you needed this marriage to work. Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. Thomas had shared her desperation, her shameful circumstances. This stranger knew that she'd come west not for love, but for survival. The humiliation burned worse than the Montana sun. He cared about you, Sam continued, his voice gentler now. Talked about you in every letter after you started writing. Said you were brave, crossing the country alone. Said you deserved better than what life had dealt you. Margaret's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Not here, not in front of these people. She'd cried enough tears in Boston over her father's gambling debts, over watching her mother waste away from grief and consumption, over the mill closure that had thrown half the neighborhood into poverty. She'd promised herself that Margaret Collins was done crying. Margaret Whitmore would be stronger, but there would be no Margaret Whitmore now. I have a proposal, Sam said, and the words hit her like a physical blow. The law out here is simple. A proxy marriage is binding if the intent is clear and witnesses are present. Thomas intended to marry you. The whole town knows it. They're all here, expecting a wedding. Margaret's mouth fell open. You can't possibly mean. I mean exactly what I said. His blue eyes never left hers. Marry me instead of Thomas. You get the protection of the Whitmore name, the security you came here seeking. I get. He hesitated, and she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his granite exterior. I get the chance to honor my brother's promise. The funeral parlor fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the whisper of September whined through the gaps in the building. Margaret felt the weight of every gaze in the room, measuring her, judging her. She thought of the long train ride back to Boston, of arriving at the station with nothing but her trunk and her shame. She thought of Emma coughing in their cold tenement room, of the look she'd received from neighbors who knew she'd failed even at becoming a frontier wife. You don't know me, she whispered. Thomas did. That's enough. But you don't. I mean, you can't want. She gestured helplessly at herself, at the ridiculous situation. Sam stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. What I want doesn't matter much in this life, Miss Collins. What matters is doing right by the people who depend on us. Thomas would have taken care of you. Since he can't, I will." Margaret's hands shook as she clutched her bouquet tighter. The wilted roses seemed to mock her flowers for a bride who would never be, for a groom who would never see his wedding day. Everything about this situation was wrong, impossible, completely mad. And yet, she looked around the room again, seeing it with different eyes. These weren't strangers come to gawk at her misfortune. They were Thomas's neighbors, his friends. People who had taken time from their harsh lives to witness what they thought would be a celebration. The woman in the front pew smiled encouragingly. The rancher by the door nodded respectfully. Children peered around their mothers' skirts with bright curiosity. They were prepared for a wedding. They expected a wedding, and Margaret Collins needed that wedding more than she needed her next breath. "The preacher's waiting," Sam said quietly. "But the choice is yours. I won't force you into anything. If you want to go back east, I'll pay for your ticket. No questions, no judgment. Back east. To what? To shame and poverty, and watching Emma work her fingers to the bone in that terrible laundry. To admitting that she'd failed at the one chance she'd had to build something better." Margaret straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She'd come 3,000 miles to become a wife. The groom had changed, but the need remained the same. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Whitmore." Something shifted in Sam's expression: relief. Perhaps her surprise that she'd actually agreed to his insane plan. He offered her his arm, solid and steady as the mountains themselves. "Then let's go get married." As they walked toward the small wooden church next door, Margaret felt the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. The train ticket purchased with her last dollars. The letters written in desperate hope. The prayer whispered in the darkness of her Boston tenement that somehow, somewhere, there was a better life waiting. She'd expected to marry Thomas Whitmore for security. Instead, she was about to marry his brother for survival. The church doors opened before them, revealing wooden pews filled with waiting guests and an altar decorated with wildflowers. Sunlight streamed through simple glass windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful in its simplicity, so different from the grand stone churches of Boston with their cold magnificence. As they stepped across the threshold, Margaret caught her reflection in the window glass, a young woman in a carefully sewn dress, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple hat, her face pale but determined. She looked like a bride. She would become a wife. Just not to the man she'd expected. The preacher, a kindly-faced man with silver hair, smiled warmly as they approached the altar. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel Whitmore and Margaret Collins in holy matrimony." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood beside this stranger who was about to become her husband. She thought of Thomas, lying cold in his casket just yards away, and wondered what he would think of this arrangement. Would he approve of his brother's gallant gesture? Would he understand the desperation that had driven her to accept? "Marriage," the preacher continued, "is not to be entered into lightly, but with reverence, discretion, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Margaret closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the brother she'd never meet. She would honor his memory by making this work. Somehow, despite the impossible circumstances, despite marrying a man she'd known for less than an hour, she would build the life Thomas had wanted to give her. When she opened her eyes, Sam was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was kindness there, and determination, and something else, a loneliness that matched her own. The preacher's voice filled the church as he spoke, the ancient words that would bind their lives together. Margaret found herself wondering what kind of man would make such an offer to a stranger. What had shaped Samuel Whitmore into someone who would honor his dead brother's promises at the cost of his own freedom? She was about to find out. preparing, and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wedding ring slid onto Margaret's finger with surprising ease, as if it had been crafted specifically for her hand rather than chosen months ago by a dead man for a bride he would never meet. The simple gold band caught the afternoon light, streaming through the church windows, transforming into a circle of fire that seemed to seal her fate with its warmth. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Patterson announced, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile reserved for moments that restore faith in human decency. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. In all her frantic calculations about survival and security, she hadn't considered this moment, the instant when custom demanded intimacy between strangers. Sam seemed to sense her panic, for he stepped closer with careful deliberation, giving her time to object or pull away. Instead of claiming her lips, he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender and respectful that tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small church, as if the entire town had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Patterson called over the celebration, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whitmore, Mrs. Samuel Whitmore." The name felt foreign in Margaret's mind, like a costume that didn't quite fit. An hour ago, she'd been Margaret Collins, failed seamstress and desperate woman. Now she bore the name of a man she'd known for less than 60 minutes, bound to him by words spoken over a dead brother's grave. The church emptied quickly as the congregation filed out into the golden afternoon, their voices carrying on the September breeze as they discussed the day's unexpected turn of events. Margaret caught snippets of conversation. "Never seen anything like it in all my days," and that Sam Whitmore's got more honor than 10 other men combined, and hope she knows what she's gotten herself into. That last comment sent a chill down Margaret's spine despite the warmth of the day. What had she gotten herself into? What did she know about Samuel Whitmore beyond his willingness to marry a stranger to honor his brother's promise? The gold ring on her finger suddenly felt heavy as a shackle. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice belonged to a woman perhaps 10 years older than Margaret, with kind brown eyes and graying hair pinned beneath a practical blue bonnet. "I'm Elena Rodriguez. My husband Miguel and I run the general store in town." Margaret managed a shaky smile. "Please call me Margaret." "Margaret, then." Elena's expression was warm but serious. "I wanted you to know what Sam did today. Marrying you like that. It's not something he'd do lightly. That man doesn't make promises he can't keep." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, a gruff voice interrupted. "Elena's right about that." A stocky man with silver-streaked hair and hands stained permanently black from his trade approached them. "I'm Frank Henderson, the blacksmith. Known Sam since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've never seen him act without thinking it through 6 ways to Sunday." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You must think I'm terrible, accepting his proposal so quickly." "I know how. It must look how it looks," Frank said firmly. "Is like a woman doing what she has to do to survive, and a man doing what he has to do to honor his kin. Ain't nothing shameful in that." Elena nodded emphatically. "Frank's right. This territory's hard on everyone, but it's especially hard on women alone. Sam knows that. Thomas knew it too." Her voice softened. "Thomas talked about you all summer, you know. Showed everyone your picture, read parts of your letters out loud at the general store. That boy was so excited about starting a family, about having someone to share his dreams with." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Thomas had cared about her, had seen her as more than just a convenient arrangement. He'd shared her letters with his friends, had looked forward to her arrival with genuine excitement. The guilt of standing here wearing his intended wedding dress, married to his brother, threatened to overwhelm her. He would have wanted this. Elena continued gently, as if reading Margaret's thoughts. Thomas would never have wanted you to go back east with nothing. He'd have been grateful to Sam for stepping in. Margaret's throat tightened. I feel like such a fraud. Wearing this dress, taking his name. You're not taking anything that wasn't freely given. Sam's voice interrupted her self-recrimination. He'd approached so quietly she hadn't heard his footsteps on the wooden church floor. The formal black coat was gone, replaced by a practical brown shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Thomas would have wanted you to have both. Margaret turned to face her new husband, searching his face for any sign of regret or second thoughts. Instead, she found the same steady determination that had prompted his proposal. "Mr. Whitmore." "Sam," he corrected. "We're married now." Might as well use first names. The simple words carried enormous weight. They were married. The reality of it struck her anew, sending her heart racing. This wasn't a dream or a desperate fantasy. She was actually Mrs. Samuel Whitmore, bound to this man by law and custom until death parted them. "Sam," she repeated, tasting the name. It suited him, straightforward, unpretentious, solid. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to interpret. "No thanks necessary. We both got what we needed." Margaret wondered what exactly he'd gotten beyond an unwanted wife and the responsibility for a stranger's welfare, but before she could ask, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices carried through the church windows, angry and getting closer. Sam's expression immediately darkened. He moved to the window, his body tensing as he peered out at the street. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "What is it?" Margaret joined him at the window. Following his gaze to where a group of men on horseback had gathered in front of the church. Even from a distance, she could see they were agitated about something, their voices carrying an edge of hostility. That made her skin crawl. "Trouble," Sam said grimly. "The kind that's been brewing all summer." Elena and Frank exchanged worried glances. "Is that Wade Morrison?" Frank asked, squinting at the riders. "Wade and his boys," Sam confirmed. "They've been stirring up sentiment against the railroad surveyors, claiming the new line will bring nothing but trouble to Copper Ridge." Margaret frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with us?" Thomas was planning to sell a strip of his land to the railroad company, Sam explained without taking his eyes off the men outside. "Good money, enough to expand the ranch and support a family." Wade and some of the other ranchers saw it as betrayal, selling out to outsiders who'd changed the character of the territory. The pieces began to fall into place in Margaret's mind, forming a picture she didn't like. The rustlers who killed Thomas were Wade Morrison's men, Sam finished, his voice hard as granite. "Can't prove it, but everyone knows. The sheriff's in Wade's pocket, so justice won't come from that quarter." Elena gasped. "Sam, you can't mean to say Wade ordered Thomas's murder." "I mean to say that convenient things have a way of happening when Wade Morrison wants them to," Sam replied. Thomas dying meant no land sale. His death sent a message to anyone else thinking of dealing with the railroad. Margaret felt sick. Thomas hadn't just been killed for his cattle, he'd been murdered. To prevent progress, to keep Copper Ridge isolated and under the control of men like Wade Morrison. And now she was married to his brother, which made her a target by association. The church door burst open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Wade Morrison strode in like he owned the building, followed by 3 other men whose hands rested conspicuously near their gun belts. Morrison was a big man gone soft around the middle, with graying hair and the kind of mustache favored by men who thought facial hair conveyed authority. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his pale eyes fixed on Sam with undisguised malice. "Heard there was a wedding today. Mighty quick work, Sam, considering your brother's not even cold in the ground." Sam stepped protectively in front of Margaret, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip, where she now noticed he wore a gun beneath his coat. "Wade, come to pay your respects?" Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Respects?" For the man who was about to sell us all out to the railroad? I think not. His gaze shifted to Margaret, looking her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. And this must be the little mail-order bride, pretty thing. Shame she hitched herself to the wrong wagon. Watch your mouth, Wade, Frank Henderson warned, stepping up beside Sam. You're in God's house. God's house? Morrison spat. God wouldn't sanction what happened here today. Marrying your dead brother's intended bride? That's not Christian, that's perverted. Margaret felt heat flood her face, but before she could respond, Sam spoke with deadly quiet. Careful, Wade. You're talking about my wife. The word wife hung in the air between them, loaded with threat and promise. Morrison's expression shifted, becoming more calculating. Your wife, is she? Well, then, I suppose that makes her business our business too. See, your brother made some promises before he died. Promises about that railroad land. Now that you're head of the Whitmore spread, I'm hoping you'll see reason where Thomas couldn't. The only thing I see, Sam said evenly, is a man who benefited. Mighty convenient-like from my brother's death. Makes a person wonder. Morrison's face darkened. You'd better be real careful about what you're implying, Sam Whitmore. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Sam's voice never rose, but the menace in it was unmistakable. Thomas is dead. The rustlers who killed him disappeared into the hills where your men ride. And now you're here on my wedding day, threatening my wife and trying to dictate how I run my land. One of Morrison's companions, a lean man with snake-cold eyes, took a step forward. Maybe we should settle this outside, Whitmore. Maybe you should get the hell out of my sight before. I forget we're in church, Sam replied. The tension in the small building was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple frontier wedding. These men weren't just business rivals. They were enemies, and blood had already been spilled. Morrison studied Sam for a long moment, then smiled without warmth. Congratulations on your marriage, Sam. I surely hope your bride understands what she's gotten herself into. The frontier can be mighty dangerous for folks who don't know their place. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but Sam remained steady as a mountain. My wife will be just fine, he said. Long as people remember their manners. Morrison touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore. Welcome to Copper Ridge. I hope your stay is a pleasant one. The emphasis on stay made it clear he expected it to be brief one way or another. As Morrison and his men filed out of the church, the silence they left behind felt deafening. Margaret realized she was shaking, and not just from fear. Anger burned in her chest, anger at being threatened on her wedding day, anger at the men who'd killed Thomas for their own greed, anger at a world where might made right and justice was whatever the strongest man decided it should be. I'm sorry, Sam said quietly. You shouldn't have had to hear that. Margaret lifted her chin, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I'm not sorry. Now I know what kind of men we're dealing with. Sam's eyes sharpened with something that might have been respect. We? I'm a Whitmore now, Margaret said, the words coming easier this time. That makes Thomas's fight my fight too. For the first time since she'd met him, Sam smiled, really smiled. Not just the polite expression he'd worn during the ceremony. The transformation was remarkable, softening his harsh features and revealing the man he might have been in a kinder world. In that case, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, offering her his arm. Let's go home. Home. The word resonated through Margaret's chest like a bell tolling. She'd been searching for home since her father died, since the mill closed, since everything she'd known crumbled around her. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found it in the most unlikely place imaginable, in the arms of a stranger who'd chosen honor over convenience, duty over desire. As they walked out of the church together, Margaret caught her reflection again in the window glass. She still looked like a bride, but something fundamental had changed. The frightened girl who'd stepped off the train that morning was gone, replaced by a woman who'd chosen to fight rather than flee. The gold band on her finger caught the light. Again, no longer feeling like a shackle but like armor. She was Margaret Whitmore now, and she'd be damned if she'd let Wade Morrison or anyone else drive her away from the life she'd just claimed. The war for Thomas's legacy and her own future was just beginning. The Whitmore ranch house emerged from the rolling prairie like a ship anchored in an ocean of golden grass. Built from local timber and mountain stone, it possessed a rugged beauty that spoke of permanence and determination in the face of an unforgiving landscape. A wraparound porch provided shade from the relentless Montana sun, while tall windows promised light and air in the long winter months ahead. Margaret sat beside Sam on the buckboard seat, her wedding dress gathering dust from the 3-mile journey from town, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes drank in every detail of what was now her home: the well-tended vegetable garden behind a split-rail fence, the barn with its fresh coat of red paint, the corrals where horses moved with lazy grace in the afternoon heat. Thomas built most of it himself, Sam said, following her gaze. Took him 5 years to get it just how he wanted. Said someday he'd add on a parlor for his wife, maybe a nursery for children. The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address. Margaret was a wife now, but what did that mean in practical terms? What had she committed herself to beyond survival and protection? What did Sam expect from this arrangement that had transformed him from bachelor to husband in the span of an hour? "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Thomas had good taste. "He had good dreams," Sam replied, his voice carrying a weight of grief she was beginning to recognize. "Always believed things would work out for the best if a man was willing to work hard enough." Margaret heard the unspoken addendum, until Wade Morrison's men cut those dreams short with bullets and fire. She thought of Thomas's letters, filled with plans for their future together, and felt a fresh stab of guilt for the deception at the heart of her new marriage. She was living a life meant for a dead man, wearing a name that should have been his. As if sensing her thoughts, Sam spoke again. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came west. I know marrying me wasn't part of your plans." Margaret twisted the unfamiliar wedding ring around her finger. "Nothing about today has gone according to plan. But I'm grateful for what you've done, Sam. More grateful than I can express." "Gratitude's not what makes a marriage work," he said quietly, "but it's a start." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. A lone rider was coming fast across the range, his horse lathered with sweat and his posture urgent with alarm. Sam's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured beside the buckboard seat. "That's Miguel Rodriguez," he said, recognition dawning. "Something's wrong." The rider pulled up in a cloud of dust, his dark face etched with worry. "Sam, thank God. I found you. You need to come quick. Wade Morrison and his men are at Elena's store. They're demanding she tell them where you took your new wife." Ice flooded Margaret's veins. Why would they want to know that? Miguel's gaze flicked to her with sympathy and fear. "Because Morrison's claiming the marriage isn't legal. Says you can't marry your dead brother's intended bride without a proper waiting period. He's got some legal papers from the territorial judge, says he's here to arrest you both for fraud." Sam's jaw tightened. Judge Hartwell's been in Morrison's pocket for years. Those papers aren't worth the ink they're printed with. "Maybe not," Miguel agreed, "but Morrison's got 6 armed men with him, and they're not interested in legal technicalities. They're tearing Yelena's store apart, claiming they're searching for evidence of your whereabouts." "Frank Henderson tried to stop them, and they pistol-whipped him," Margaret gasped. Frank, who'd welcomed her so kindly at the church, was hurt because of her marriage to Sam. The guilt she'd been carrying suddenly felt crushing. "This is my fault," she whispered. "If I hadn't agreed to marry you, You'd be on a train back to Boston by now. And Morrison would still be causing trouble. Sam cut her off. This isn't about you, Margaret. It's about the railroad land and what my family represents to men like Wade Morrison. He turned to Miguel. How many men does he have with him? 6, like I said, all armed, all mean, and Sam ... Miguel hesitated. There's talk in town that Morrison's planning to make an example of you. Says the territory needs to know what happens to people who side with outsiders against their own kind. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Morrison wasn't just threatening them. He was planning to turn their defiance into a public lesson in intimidation. She thought of Elena, probably terrified as armed men ransacked her store, and Frank, bleeding from defending people he barely knew. We have to go back, she said firmly. Sam stared at her. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Those people are in danger because of us, Margaret insisted. Elena and Frank stood up for our marriage, and now they're paying the price. I won't hide here while innocent people suffer on our behalf. Margaret, you don't understand what you're saying. Morrison's men are killers. They murdered Thomas, and they won't hesitate to do the same to anyone who gets in their way. Then we make sure they don't get the chance. Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. You said yourself that this isn't really about me. It's about standing up to bullies who think they can control everyone through fear. Well, I'm tired of being afraid. Sam studied her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Whatever he saw there seemed to convince him she meant every word. If we go back, we do this my way, he said finally. No heroics, no taking unnecessary risks. We get Elena and Frank to safety, then we deal with Morrison. Margaret nodded, though privately she wasn't sure what dealing with Morrison might entail. She was beginning to understand that the frontier operated by different rules than the civilized East, where disputes were settled in courtrooms rather than dusty streets. Miguel, how many folks in town can we count on? Sam asked. The Mexican man considered carefully. Reverend Patterson will stand with you. He's furious about what happened at the store. Doc Williams too, especially since Frank's bleeding all over his surgery. Maybe half a dozen others, but Morrison's got most people scared. That'll have to be enough. Sam turned the buckboard around with practiced efficiency. Margaret, I want you to promise me something. When we get to town, you stay back until I tell you it's safe. I don't care how noble your intentions are. Won't have Morrison using you as leverage against me. Margaret wanted to argue, but the steel in his voice told her this wasn't negotiable. I promise. The ride back to Copper Ridge passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the creak of the buckboard wheels. Margaret found herself studying Sam's profile, noting the set of his jaw and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for threats. This was a side of him she hadn't seen before, not the courteous gentleman who'd married her to honor his brother's promise, but the hard man forged by frontier life and personal loss. As they crested the hill overlooking town, the full scope of Morrison's intimidation became clear. Armed men lounged outside the general store while others patrolled the main street, their presence ensuring that no one would interfere with whatever was happening inside. Most of the townspeople had disappeared into their homes and businesses, leaving the streets eerily empty except for Morrison's gang. There, Miguel pointed toward the livery stable. Doc Williams is tending to Frank in the back room. Elena's locked herself in the store's cellar, but Morrison's men are threatening to smoke her out if she doesn't come up and answer their questions. Sam's hands tightened on the reins. Cowards, threatening a woman because they can't find the men they're really after. They approached the town from the east, using the livery stable to shield their arrival from Morrison's lookouts. Doc Williams met them at the stable door, his usually neat appearance disheveled and his shirt stained with blood. Thank God you're here, he said quietly. Frank's got a concussion, but he'll live. Elena's holding out for now, but Morrison's getting impatient. He's already threatened to burn down the store if she doesn't tell him where you went. Margaret felt sick. This was escalating beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd insisted on returning to town. Real people were being hurt, their livelihoods threatened, because she'd married Sam Whitmore. Where is Morrison now? Sam asked. In the store with 2 of his men. The others are spread around town, making sure nobody interferes. Doc Williams looked directly at Margaret. Ma'am, I don't mean to be presumptuous, but maybe if you went to him yourself, told him you were leaving town voluntarily. No. Sam's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. That's exactly what he wants to prove, that he can drive people out through intimidation. If we give in now, he'll own this town completely. Margaret stepped forward, surprising herself with her calm. What do you need me to do? Both men stared at her. Margaret, Sam began. I meant what I said earlier. I'm a Whitmore now, and I won't run from bullies. She met Sam's eyes steadily. Tell me the plan. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to include her. Then something shifted in his expression. Acceptance, perhaps, or recognition that she wasn't the helpless Eastern flower he'd married that morning. All right, he said slowly, but we do this smart. Doc, can you get word to Reverend Patterson? Tell him to gather anyone willing to stand up to Morrison at the church. When I give the signal 3 shots in the air, I want them to come running. Doc Williams nodded and hurried away. Sam turned to Miguel. I need you to work your way around to the back of the store. When the shooting starts, and it will start, I want you to get Elena out through the cellar door. And me? Margaret asked. Sam hesitated, then reached into the buckboard and pulled out a small derringer. Do you know how to use this? Margaret stared at the compact weapon, its silver surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. I've never held a gun in my life. Point it at whoever's threatening you and pull the trigger. It's only got 2 shots, so make them count. He pressed the derringer into her hands, his fingers warm against hers. I hope to God you won't need it, but I'm not taking any chances with your safety. The weight of the weapon was surprisingly heavy, and Margaret found herself wondering if she'd actually be able to use it when the moment came. Could she point this at another human being and pull the trigger? Could she take a life to save her own? What about you? She asked. Sam's smile was grim. I'm going to walk into that store and invite Morrison to settle this like men instead of hiding behind threats to women and old storekeepers. Margaret's heart lurched. That's suicide. You can't face all of them alone. I won't be alone. Sam's gaze held hers. I'll have the knowledge that my wife is safe, and that's worth more than all the guns Morrison can hire. Before she could protest further, he was moving, checking his rifle and adjusting the gun belt around his waist with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before. Margaret realized with growing horror that this wasn't the first time. Sam had faced down armed men, and it might not be the last. Sam, she called softly as he prepared to leave the stable. He turned back, eyebrows raised. Come back to me, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Please. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, gratitude, something deeper she couldn't name. Yes, ma'am, I surely will. Then he was gone, walking toward the general store with long, confident strides that belied the danger he was walking into. Margaret watched from the stable doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs as her husband, prepared to risk his life for people who were suffering because of choices she'd helped make. The derringer felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she realized that in the space of one afternoon, she'd gained a home, a husband, and a cause worth fighting for. Now all she had to do was survive long enough to appreciate any of it. In the distance, she could see Morrison's men beginning to notice Sam's approach. The confrontation that would define the rest of her life was about to begin. The standoff lasted 17 minutes by the church clock, 17 minutes that felt like hours as Sam faced down Wade Morrison in the middle of Copper Ridge's main street. Margaret watched from the livery stable, her knuckles white around the derringer's handle. As the two men circled each other like wolves testing for weakness. Morrison had emerged from the general store with predictable bluster, demanding Sam surrender his illegal bride and submit to arrest on charges of fraud. But when faced with Sam's steady rifle and the gradual appearance of armed townspeople from doorways and alleys, his confidence had begun to crack. "You're outnumbered, Whitmore," Morrison called out, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "My men have this town surrounded." "Your men," Sam replied calmly, "seem to have developed a sudden interest in other places." It was true. As word of the confrontation spread, Morrison's hired guns had found themselves facing angry shopkeepers, determined farmers, and the kind of frontier justice that didn't require a courtroom. 3 of them had already ridden out of town at full gallop, unwilling to face the growing crowd of Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers. The turning point came when Reverend Patterson emerged from the church, carrying his father's old cavalry saber, followed by a dozen parishioners armed with everything from hunting rifles to kitchen knives. Morrison, faced with half the town arrayed against him, finally accepted what his pride had been denying. He'd overplayed his hand. "This isn't over, Whitmore," he snarled as he backed toward his horse. "The territorial government won't stand for vigilante justice." Then maybe the territorial government should try providing actual justice for a change. Alina Rodriguez called from the store doorway, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "Instead of letting murderers hide behind bought judges and corrupt sheriffs." Morrison's face flushed red with rage, but he was smart enough to recognize defeat when it stared him down the barrel of 20 rifles. He mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster and rode out of town, trailing the last of his remaining men like a pack of whipped dogs. The cheers that erupted from the townspeople echoed off the mountains, a sound of triumph and relief that seemed to shake the very foundations of Copper Ridge. Margaret found herself laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't begin to name. Sam had kept his word. He'd come back to her, and he'd done it without spilling blood in the streets. But the aftermath brought its own challenges. As the crowd dispersed and the adrenaline faded, Margaret realized that the easy part was over. She'd married a stranger, claimed a name that wasn't hers, and committed herself to a life she didn't understand. Now she had to figure out how to actually live it. The ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. Sam seemed lost in thought, perhaps processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. They'd faced down the most powerful man in the territory and won, but victory came with consequences. Morrison wouldn't forget this humiliation, and his next move would likely be even more dangerous. "You were magnificent," Margaret said as the ranch house came into view again, its windows glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Sam glanced at her with surprise. "I didn't do anything special. Just stood up to a bully. You united an entire town against corruption and intimidation. That's not nothing special. That's leadership." Margaret adjusted her position on the buckboard seat, suddenly aware of how the long day had wrinkled and stained her wedding dress. "I've never seen anything like it." "You've never lived on the frontier before," Sam replied. "Out here, people depend on each other for survival. When someone threatens that bond, the community responds." As they pulled up to the house, Margaret felt a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. This was her home now, but what did that mean? What were the expectations, spoken and unspoken, that came with being Sam Whitmore's wife? Sam seemed to sense her uncertainty. As he helped her down from the buckboard, his hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "Margaret, I want you to understand something. What happened today, the marriage, the confrontation with Morrison, it doesn't obligate you to anything beyond what we agreed to. You have my name and my protection, but I won't force anything else on you." The words should have been reassuring, but Margaret found herself oddly disappointed. Was he already regretting their hasty union? had the reality of being tied to a stranger begun to sink in. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate your consideration." They stood there for a moment, two people bound by law but separated by uncertainty, before Sam cleared his throat and gestured toward the house. "Come on, I'll show you around your new home." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed. The main room featured a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space, surrounded by furniture that was clearly handmade but skillfully crafted. A kitchen occupied one corner, complete with a cast-iron stove and shelves lined with preserved goods. Stairs led to a loft area that served as the bedroom. Thomas was handy with tools, Sam explained as Margaret ran her fingers along the smooth surface of a wooden table. Made most of the furniture himself during the long winter months. Said it gave him something to do besides worry about the cattle. Margaret noticed the care with which Sam spoke of his brother, not the bitter grief of fresh loss, but the gentle melancholy of someone who'd learned to carry sorrow without being crushed by it. "How long has it been since you lost him?" 3 weeks yesterday. Sam moved to the kitchen area, busying himself with lighting the stove. "Seems longer somehow. Like a different lifetime," Margaret calculated quickly. 3 weeks ago, she'd been in Boston, still receiving Thomas's letters. Still planning a future that would never exist. The timing felt cruel. If she'd left just a week earlier, she might have met the man she'd actually intended to marry. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for your loss and for the way everything happened. You shouldn't have had to deal with Morrison and his threats on top of losing Thomas." Sam paused in his work, considering her words. Morrison's been looking for an excuse to drive the Whitmores off this land for years. Thomas's death just gave him an opportunity. If it hadn't been about the railroad deal, it would have been something else. "Why does he want your land so badly?" "Water rights, mostly. Our property sits on one of the best stream systems in the territory. Control the water, control the ranchers who depend on it." Sam struck a match and lit the kindling in the stove. "Plus, Thomas and I never bent the knee to Morrison's vision of how things should work around here. That made us a threat to his authority." Margaret absorbed this information, beginning to understand the larger forces at play. She'd stumbled into more than a marriage of convenience. She'd become part of a territorial power struggle that had already claimed one life and would likely claim more before it ended. "What happens now?" she asked. Sam straightened up from the stove, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Now we try to build the life Thomas wanted to build. We work the ranch, we support each other, and we don't let bastards like Morrison drive us off land that's rightfully ours." The simple determination in his voice stirred something in Margaret's chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. It was about honoring Thomas's memory by fulfilling his dreams, even if the circumstances had changed beyond recognition. "I don't know anything about ranching," she admitted. "In Boston, the closest I came to livestock was the milk cart that came down our street twice a week." Sam's mouth quirked upward in what might have been a smile. "Then I guess you'll learn. Thomas always said the best education was the kind that came from necessity." Over the next hour, Sam gave Margaret a thorough tour of the property. He showed her the chicken coop, where fat hens clucked importantly over their nests. He explained the feeding schedule for the horses and demonstrated how to work the hand pump that brought water up from the well. Everything was practical, necessary knowledge for frontier life, but Margaret found herself paying as much attention to the man providing the instruction as to the information itself. Sam moved through the ranch with easy confidence, clearly at home in this environment in a way she'd never been anywhere. His hands were gentle with the animals, patient with Margaret's questions, efficient in every task. She began to understand why Thomas had trusted his brother enough to leave the ranch in his care. Sam was the kind of man who took responsibility seriously and followed through on his commitments. As evening approached, they returned to the house to prepare supper. Margaret expected awkwardness as they navigated the intimate space of the kitchen together, but instead found an unexpected ease developing between them. Sam worked with quiet efficiency, preparing salt pork and beans while Margaret sliced bread and set the table with Thomas's handmade plates. "You know," Margaret said as they sat down to eat, "I never thanked you properly for what you did today." Standing up to Morrison, protecting Elena and Frank, that took real courage. Sam paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "I did what any decent man would do." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Most men would have found excuses to avoid confrontation. You chose to fight for what was right, even when it put you in danger." She met his eyes across the small table. "Thomas chose well when he trusted you with his legacy." Something shifted in Sam's expression, a softening around the edges that transformed his entire face. "Thomas always believed the best of people. Sometimes I think he believed better of me than I deserved." "I don't think that's true," Margaret said quietly. "I think he saw exactly who you are, someone willing to sacrifice his own comfort to honor a promise to a dead brother." They finished the meal in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself studying the details of her new home, the way lamplight danced across the log walls, the sound of wind moving through the eaves, the comfortable weight of fatigue settling into her bones after the longest day of her life. When it came time to address sleeping arrangements, Sam solved the problem with characteristic directness. "You take the bed upstairs," he said, already spreading blankets on the floor near the fireplace. "I'll be comfortable down here." Margaret wanted to protest. It seemed wrong to displace him from his own bedroom, but the relief she felt told her this was the right arrangement for now. They needed time to adjust to each other, to figure out what their marriage would become beyond the legal formalities. "Sam," she said as she prepared to climb the stairs. He looked up from arranging his makeshift bed. "Yes? Thank you. For everything. For giving me a chance at a new life." "Thank you for taking it," he replied. Thomas would have been glad to know his bride found her way home, even if the path wasn't what any of us expected. Home. There was that word again, carrying more weight each time she heard it. As Margaret climbed the stairs to the loft bedroom, she realized that for the first time since leaving Boston, she actually felt like she might be heading toward one. Bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in one of Thomas's quilts and a window that looked out over the moonlit prairie. Margaret changed into her nightgown, one of the few items of clothing she owned that wasn't practical travel wear, and sat on the edge of the bed to brush out her hair dot in the mirror of Thomas's shaving stand. She caught sight of herself and paused. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate girl who'd boarded the train in Boston. Her eyes held a confidence that hadn't been there before, and her posture spoke of someone who'd found something worth fighting. FOR Mrs. Samuel Whitmore. The name still felt foreign, but it was beginning to feel possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to manage a frontier household, navigating her relationship with Sam, preparing for whatever revenge Morrison might be planning. But tonight, for the first time in years, Margaret fell asleep feeling safe. Downstairs, Sam lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into night. But now there was something new, the soft whisper of movement from the loft above, the knowledge that he was no longer alone in the house. Thomas had built for dreams that would never be realized. He'd married a stranger to honor his brothers. Promise, but as sleep finally claimed him, Sam found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, they might find a way to build something real from the ashes of tragedy. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something dangerously close to hope. The nightmare came on the third night. Margaret jerked awake in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart hammering and her nightgown soaked with cold sweat. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The unfamiliar shadows of the loft bedroom seemed to close in around her like the walls of the Boston tenement where she'd watched her mother die. In her dream, she'd been back in that airless room, holding her mother's fevered hand while Emma coughed blood into a rag that would never be clean again. The smell of sickness and despair had been so vivid she could still taste it on her tongue, metallic and hopeless. But this time, when she'd looked down at the dying woman's face, it had been Thomas Whitmore staring back at her with accusation in his eyes. "You took my life," Dream Thomas had whispered. "You're wearing my wife's dress, living in my house, sleeping in my bed. What right do you have to the happiness I'll never know?" Margaret pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Below, she could hear Sam moving around the kitchen, the familiar sounds of morning chores that had become oddly comforting over the past few days. He rose before dawn every day, starting the fire and putting coffee on before heading out to tend the animals. She'd learned to time her own rising to the sound of his boots on the stairs, giving him privacy for his early routines while ensuring she was dressed and ready to help with breakfast by the time he returned. But this morning, the guilt that had been gnawing at her since the wedding finally demanded acknowledgement. She couldn't continue living this lie, accepting Sam's kindness and protection, without telling him the truth about why she'd really come west. Margaret, dressed quickly in one of the simple work dresses Sam had found in Thomas's things intended for the bride who would never wear them. The irony wasn't lost on her as she smoothed the brown calico over her hips and tied the apron strings. Even her clothes were borrowed from a dead man's dreams. She found Sam in the barn, forking hay into the horse stalls with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. The big sorrel gelding he rode whickered softly at her approach, and Sam looked up with the smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past few days. "You're up early," he said, leaning the pitchfork against the stall wall. "Bad dreams?" The perceptiveness of the question caught her off guard. "How did you know? You weren't the only one awake. Heard you moving around up there." His expression grew concerned. "Want to talk about it?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the barn. "Sam, there are things about me you don't know. Things I should have told you before you married me." Something flickered in his eyes, wariness perhaps, or resignation. "I figured as much. People don't usually travel 3,000 miles to marry strangers unless they're running from something." The matter-of-fact tone of his response should have been reassuring, but it only made Margaret feel worse. He'd suspected she was hiding something and had married her anyway, out of duty to his dead brother. The kindness of that gesture made her deception feel even more shameful. "I wasn't entirely honest in my letters to Thomas," she began, the words feeling like stones in her throat. "About my circumstances, about why I wanted to come west." Sam settled onto a hay bale, giving her his full attention. "Tell me." The simple invitation broke something loose inside her chest. The story came out in fits and starts, punctuated by long pauses as she struggled to find words for experiences that had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. She told him about her father, Patrick Collins, who'd worked in the Lowell textile mills for 15 years before the drink took hold of him completely. How he'd started gambling away his wages, convinced that the next card game or horse race would solve all their problems. How her mother had taken in sewing to make ends meet, working by candlelight until her eyes gave out and her lungs filled with lint and despair. "When the mill started closing," Margaret continued, pacing the barn aisle like a caged animal, "Papa got desperate. He borrowed money from the wrong people, promised he'd pay it back with interest when his luck turned. But luck never turned. For Patrick Collins, it just kept getting worse." Sam listened without interruption, his face grave but not judgmental. Margaret found courage in his silence, in the way he didn't flinch when she described the visit from her father's creditors' men, with dead eyes and scarred knuckles, who'd made it clear that debts would be collected one way or another. "Mama died that winter," she said quietly. "Consumption, the doctor said, but I knew better. She died of heartbreak and exhaustion. Worn down by years of trying to hold our family together while Papa tore it apart piece by piece, the barn fell. Silent except for the soft sounds of horses breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. Margaret stood with her back to Sam, unable to meet his eyes as she continued. After the funeral, the creditors came again. They wanted the money Papa owed, and they didn't care that he was dead. Said the debt passed to his children. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They gave me two choices: work off the debt in one of their establishments, or find another way to pay them what was owed. Sam's sharp intake of breath told her he understood exactly what kind of establishment she meant. When she finally turned to face him, his expression was thunderous, but the anger wasn't directed at her. "How much?" he asked quietly. $300. The amount still felt enormous, impossible. More money than I could earn in 5 years, even if I could find decent work, and with Emma to take care of. She shrugged helplessly. I started looking at newspaper advertisements for mail-order brides. It seemed like the only way out that didn't involve ... She couldn't finish the sentence. "So you wrote to Thomas?" Margaret nodded miserably. I told him I was a seamstress, looking for a new start in the West. I said I wanted to be part of building something meaningful, to contribute to a partnership. All true, as far as it went, but I never mentioned the debt or why I really needed to leave Boston. "Did you tell him about Emma?" "Only that I had a younger sister who was well situated with employment." Margaret's laugh was bitter, another half-truth. "Emma found work in a laundry, 12 hours a day in steam and chemicals for barely enough to pay rent on a room the size of a closet. I told myself I'd send for her once I was established here, but the truth is, I was just desperate to escape." Sam was quiet for so long that Margaret began to fear she'd finally said something unforgivable. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than accusatory. "What happened to the debt? Did those men just let you leave?" Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. "I told them I was marrying a rancher in Montana Territory. Said my new husband would pay what was owed once I was settled." The admission hung between them like a sword. I knew it was wrong, but I was so scared, Sam. I couldn't see any other way out. "So they think I'm going to pay your father's gambling debts?" "Yes." The word came out as barely a breath. "I know how it sounds. I know what that makes me. But I swear to you, I never intended for Thomas to get hurt, and I never meant to deceive anyone about Margaret." Sam's voice cut through her spiraling. "Confession, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. She expected to see disgust or betrayal, but instead found something that looked almost like relief. "Is that all?" He asked up. The question was so unexpected that Margaret blinked in confusion. "All?" "Sam, I just told you that I married you under false pretenses, that I'm being pursued by debt collectors who expect you to pay money you don't owe them. How is that not enough?" Sam stood up from the hay bale, moving closer but stopping just out of arm's reach. "Because I was afraid you were going to tell me you were still in love with another man, or that you were married already, or that you'd committed some crime that would bring the law down on us." His mouth quirked upward slightly. "Compared to those possibilities, a gambling debt seems almost manageable." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Manageable?" "Sam, it's $300. That's more than most people see in a lifetime." "It's money," he said simply. "Money can be earned or borrowed or negotiated. What matters is that you told me the truth, even when you were afraid of how I'd react." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. She'd cried enough tears in Boston, she wouldn't add to them here. "There's more," she said quietly. Sam waited, patient as always. "The night before I left Boston, one of the creditors came to see me. A man named Sullivan with scars on his hands and ice in his eyes." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, remembering. "He told me that if my new husband didn't pay up within 6 months, they'd come west to collect. He said frontier towns had accidents all the time, and it would be a shame if anything happened to my new family. This time Sam's reaction was immediate and violent. His hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, and his jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. He threatened you directly? He threatened anyone I cared about. Margaret's voice broke slightly. On the words, don't you see? By marrying you, I've put you in danger. Sullivan and his men might be on their way here right now, and it would be my fault if anything happened to you. Sam was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke, his voice was calm but deadly serious. Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This Sullivan and his friends are city criminals used to intimidating people who have nowhere to run and no one to protect them. Out here, things work differently. What do you mean? I mean that if Sullivan or anyone else comes to my ranch making threats against my wife, they'll discover that Montana Territory has its own way of dealing with men who prey on women and families. Sam's eyes were hard as granite. This is my land, and you're under my protection now. That means something out here. Margaret wanted to believe him, but the memory of Sullivan's cold smile was too vivid. You don't understand what these men are capable of. They've been collecting debts in Boston for years, and they don't make empty threats. Then they'll learn that threatening a rancher's wife in Montana Territory is different from terrorizing seamstresses in Boston. Sam stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. Margaret, I know you think you've trapped me in something I didn't sign up for, but you're wrong. I married you knowing there were secrets, knowing you were running from something. That doesn't change anything. But the money will figure. Out the money. Maybe we sell some cattle. Maybe we take out a loan against the ranch. Hell, maybe we just wait for Sullivan to show up and explain to him personally that his services are no longer required. Sam's smile was grim but determined. The point is, we'll face it together. That's what marriage means, even marriages that start the way ours did. Margaret felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For months, she'd carried the weight of her secrets alone, convinced that anyone who knew the truth would turn away in disgust. But Sam stood before her, fully aware of her deception and her danger, and he wasn't running. Why? She whispered. Why would you take on my problems when you could just send me back to Boston and be done with it? Sam was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he'd even heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice was soft with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Because Thomas believed in you. Because you've worked harder in 3 days than most people work in a month. Because you stood up to Wade Morrison when you could have hidden. And because you told me the truth, even when you were afraid I'd hate you for it. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. And because somewhere in the last 3 days, I've started to believe that maybe we could build something real together, secrets and all. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Margaret felt her heart racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. For the first time since leaving Boston, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might have found not just safety, but something much more precious. Sam, she began, then stopped, not sure how to put her feelings into words. I know, he said quietly. It's complicated. We're practically strangers, and you're dealing with enough upheaval without me adding to it. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Margaret. I'm just saying that when you're ready to stop running from the past, I'll be here. The promise settled around her like a warm blanket, offering comfort without demanding anything. In return, Margaret realized that this was what safety actually felt like, not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone willing to face that danger alongside you. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than any words she'd ever spoken. Sam nodded, then picked up the pitchfork again, signaling a return to the comfortable routines that had begun to define their days together. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The secrets were out, the truth acknowledged. And somehow that made everything else seem possible. As Margaret headed back to the house to start breakfast, she found herself thinking about Emma, probably already at work in the steaming hell of the Boston laundry. Soon, she promised herself. Soon she'd have enough security to send for her sister, to give Emma the same chance at a new life that Sam had given her. The thought of building a real family here, in this place Thomas had loved, filled her with something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Not the desperate hope of escape, but the quiet hope of belonging somewhere, to someone, in a way that mattered. Behind her, she could hear Sam whistling as he worked, the sound carrying across the morning air like a promise that today would be better than yesterday, and tomorrow might be better still. 2 weeks after Margaret's confession, the first letter arrived. She found it tucked under a stone on the porch steps. When she went out to collect eggs from the chicken coop, her name written in careful script across cream-colored paper that looked expensive and out of place against the rough-hewn logs of the ranch house. Margaret's hands trembled as she recognized the handwriting, not Sullivan's crude scrawl, but the educated penmanship of someone who handled such correspondence professionally. Inside, the message was brief and terrifying in its politeness: Mrs. Samuel Whitmore, your continued absence from Boston has been noted with concern by interested parties. Mr. Sullivan wishes to remind you that certain obligations remain outstanding and that the agreed-upon timeframe for resolution approaches rapidly. He trusts that your new circumstances have improved your ability to honor your father's commitments. A representative will call upon you soon to discuss terms. Most respectfully, J. Caldwell, attorney at law. Margaret sank onto the porch steps, the letter crumpling in her white-knuckled grip. 6 months. That's what Sullivan had given her, and barely 2 had passed. But somehow, they'd found her. In this vast territory, in this remote corner of Montana, Patrick Collins's debts had tracked her down like bloodhounds following a scent. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up sharply, fear spiking through her veins. But it was only Sam returning from the north pasture, his hat pushed back and his shirt dark with sweat from a morning spent mending fence line. The sight of him solid, dependable, completely unaware of the new threat that had just arrived, made her chest tight with guilt and terror. Margaret? Sam swung down from his horse, his expression immediately concerned. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. She held up the letter with shaking hands. Worse than a ghost. They found me. Sam's face went very still as he read the letter, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. When did this arrive? Just now. It was under the stone by the steps. Margaret stood on unsteady legs, wrapping her arms around herself. They know where I am, Sam. They know I'm married to you. God knows what else they've learned. Easy. Sam's voice was calm, but she could see the storm building behind his eyes. Let's think this through. How long would it take for someone to travel from Boston to Montana territory? Margaret forced herself to focus, to push past the panic clouding her thoughts. By train? Maybe 10 days if they didn't stop. But they'd have to know where to look first, and there are dozens of towns along the railroad line. How could they have found Copper Ridge so quickly? Someone told them. Sam's words were flat with certainty. Someone who knew about your marriage. Who knew where you were living. The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. You think someone here betrayed us? I think Wade Morrison has friends in a lot of places, and some of those friends might have connections back east. Sam began pacing the porch, his boots marking a restless rhythm on the weathered boards. Morrison knew you were a mail order. Bride from Boston. Wouldn't take much effort to put word out through certain channels. Ask if anyone was looking for a woman matching your description. Margaret felt sick. Morrison's reach extended far beyond Copper Ridge, into networks of corruption and violence that spanned the continent. She'd thought marriage to Sam would protect her, but instead she'd only drawn him into the web of her father's mistakes, I have to leave, she said quietly. If I disappear, if they can't find me, no. The word cracked like a whip. Sam stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that brooked no argument. Running won't solve anything. These men are professional collectors. They'll follow you wherever you go. The only way to end this is to face it head on. Face it how? You read the letter, Sam. They're sending someone here. Someone who won't be impressed by frontier justice or community solidarity. These aren't local bullies like Morrison. They're killers from the city, and they know exactly how to get what they want. Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where heat wave shimmered above the golden grass. When? He spoke. His voice carried a weight of decision that made Margaret's heart race. Then we'll be ready for them. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both turn toward the road. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, too large for a single rider, too fast for casual travel. Sam's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, expecting company. Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. No, Sam stepped protectively in front of her. Get inside, now. But Margaret found herself rooted to the spot as the riders came into view. There were 5 of them, dressed in dark suits despite the Montana heat, their horses lathered from hard travel. They moved with the predatory confidence of men accustomed to intimidating their prey, and even at a distance, Margaret could see the bulge of weapons beneath their coats. The lead rider was a tall, thin man with silver hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle, though everything else about him screamed city sophisticate. This wasn't Sullivan. Margaret would have recognized that scarred face anywhere, but someone far more dangerous. Someone with education, connections, and the kind of cold intelligence that made him infinitely more threatening than a simple street thug. Mrs. Whitmore, the man called as the group pulled up in front of the ranch house. His voice carried the cultured tones of Boston's better neighborhoods, the accent of privilege and power. I'm Jonathan Caldwell. I believe you received my letter. Margaret's throat felt like sandpaper. This was the attorney who'd written the polite threat, but seeing him in person made her realize she'd vastly underestimated the scope of the forces arrayed against her. These weren't back-alley criminals. They were organized, professional, and backed by resources she couldn't even imagine. Mr. Caldwell, Sam said evenly, not moving from his protective position, you're a long way from home. Caldwell's pale eyes shifted to Sam with calculating interest. Mr. Whitmore, I presume, your reputation precedes you, sir. I understand you've recently married my client's debtor. I've married my wife, Sam corrected. Any debts she might have inherited died with the man who created them. Caldwell's smile was thin as winter ice. I'm afraid the law sees things differently. But perhaps we might discuss this matter in a more civilized manner. The sun is quite harsh, and we've traveled a considerable distance. You can stake your business from right where you are, Sam replied. My wife and I have work to do. Very well. Caldwell reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a leather portfolio. Patrick Collins owed my clients $300 plus accumulated interest. That debt has now grown to $450, compounded over the months since Mr. Collins's unfortunate demise. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. $450 more money than the ranch might earn in 2 good years. The amount was impossible, designed to ensure that she could never escape her father's legacy. Even if we accepted the validity of this debt, Sam said carefully, we don't have that kind of money. Oh, but I think you do. Caldwell's smile widened, showing teeth like tombstones. You see, Mr. Whitmore, I've made extensive inquiries about your circumstances. This ranch represents considerable value: prime grazing land, water rights, proximity to the proposed railroad. My clients would be willing to accept the property as payment in full. The trap revealed itself with crystalline clarity. This had never been about collecting a gambling debt. It was about acquiring valuable frontier land through legal extortion. Patrick Collins's creditors had researched Margaret's marriage, investigated Sam's holdings, and crafted a scheme to steal everything he'd worked for under the color of law. "You're claiming my ranch is worth less than $500? Sam's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm claiming that it's worth exactly what my clients are owed," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Frontier properties can be difficult to value accurately, especially when they might face certain complications regarding clear title." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. These men had the connections to tie up Sam's land rights in legal challenges for years, bleeding him dry with court costs and bureaucratic delays. They could destroy his life without firing a single shot. One of Caldwell's companions, a broad-shouldered man with dead eyes and scarred knuckles, shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Caldwell, maybe we should—" "Patience, Mr. Sullivan," Caldwell said. Mildly, Margaret's blood turned to ice. Sullivan, the man who'd threatened her in Boston, who'd promised to follow her west and collect what was owed. He sat his horse like a predator waiting for permission to strike, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You have 48 hours to consider our generous offer," Caldwell continued, returning the portfolio to his coat. "We'll be staying at the hotel in Copper Ridge, should you wish to discuss terms. I do hope you'll see reason, Mr. Whitmore. Frontier life can be so unpredictable." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following. In perfect formation, they moved like a military unit, disciplined and dangerous, leaving behind only dust and the lingering scent of threat. Margaret stood frozen on the porch, watching until the riders disappeared into the heat shimmer. When she finally turned to Sam, she found him staring after them with an expression she'd never seen before: cold, calculating, and absolutely lethal. "Sam?" she whispered. "Pack light," he said without looking at her. "Enough for a few days' travel. Where are we going?" "To get help." Sam finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her step back. "Caldwell made one mistake. He assumed I'd face this alone." "I don't understand." Sam's smile was sharp as a blade. "You're about to learn something about frontier justice, Margaret. Out here, when someone threatens your family, you don't just roll over and die, you fight back. But they have the law on their side. They have bought judges and corrupt officials on their side," Sam corrected. "But there's a difference between the law and justice, and sometimes justice requires taking matters into your own hands." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain breeze. "Sam, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to save my wife and my ranch," he said simply. "Whatever it takes." As Sam strode toward the barn to saddle fresh horses, Margaret remained on the porch, staring at the empty road where Caldwell and his men had disappeared. 48 hours. In less than 2 days, she would either find a way to defeat enemies with resources and connections beyond her imagination, or she would lose everything, including the man who'd given her a chance at happiness. The letter in Sam's pocket crinkled as he moved, a reminder that the past had finally caught up with them. But as Margaret watched her husband prepare for war, she realized that maybe, just maybe, the past was about to discover that Margaret Whitmore was no longer the frightened girl who'd fled Boston in desperation. She was a rancher's wife now. And that meant something in Montana, territory, something worth fighting for. The ride to the territorial capital of Helena took 18 hours of hard travel through mountain passes and river valleys that seemed carved by the hand of God himself. Margaret had never seen country so wild and beautiful, but she barely noticed the towering peaks or rushing streams. Her mind was fixed on the man they'd come to see, Judge William Mackenzie, the one honest magistrate in a territory riddled with corruption. Sam had explained during their overnight stop at a way station that Mackenzie was a Civil War veteran who'd come west to escape the politics of Washington, only to find himself fighting a different Kind of war against the men who sought to buy and sell justice like any other commodity. If anyone could help them navigate the legal trap Caldwell had set, it would be Mackenzie. But first, they had to reach him alive. The attack came at dawn, just as they crested Whitefish Ridge, overlooking the Helena Valley. Margaret heard the crack of a rifle an instant before Sam threw himself sideways in his saddle, blood spraying from his left shoulder as the bullet found its mark. "Ambush!" he shouted, spurring his horse toward a cluster of boulders that offered the only cover on the exposed ridgeline. "Stay low." Margaret flattened herself against her horse's neck as more shots rang out from the pine trees below. She could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies, at least 4 different positions surrounding their path down the mountain. Caldwell hadn't waited for his ultimatum to expire. He'd sent killers to end the problem permanently. Sam reached the rocks first, sliding from his saddle with his rifle in hand, despite the blood soaking his shirt. "Margaret!" "This way!" She spurred her horse after him, feeling the whistle of bullets pass close enough to part her hair. The mare stumbled on loose shale, and for one terrifying moment, Margaret thought they'd both go tumbling down the mountainside. But the animal recovered, lunging forward with the desperate strength of prey fleeing predators. They reached the shelter of the boulder field just as a fresh volley of shots shattered the morning air. Sam pulled Margaret down behind a granite outcrop, his face pale but his eyes blazing with fury. "How many?" Margaret gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. 4, maybe 5. Professional shooters, not local hired guns. Sam checked his rifle, wincing as the movement aggravated his shoulder wound. "They've got us pinned down good." "Your shoulder, it'll keep." Sam peered around the edge of their shelter, drawing immediate fire from the hidden gunmen. "But we can't stay here. They'll work around behind us eventually." Margaret felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had driven her to stand up to Wade Morrison in the church. She was tired of running, tired of being hunted like an animal by men who thought they could steal and kill with impunity. "Give me this spare rifle," she said. Sam stared at her. "Margaret, you've never fired a gun in your life." "Then it's time." "I learned." She met his gaze steadily. "I won't cower behind rocks while they try to murder my husband." Something shifted in Sam's expression: surprise, admiration, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite the danger surrounding them. He handed her the Winchester without further argument. "Sight down the barrel, squeeze the trigger gentle-like," he instructed quickly. "Don't jerk it, and remember the bullet drops over distance." Margaret nodded, checking the rifle's mechanism. With trembling hands, the weapon felt alien and deadly, but she forced herself to remember what was at stake. These men had come to kill Sam, to steal everything they'd begun to build together. She wouldn't let that happen. "On my signal, we move to those rocks on the left," Sam said, pointing to another cluster of boulders about 20 yards away. "I'll draw their fire, you run." "No," Margaret's voice was firm. "We go together or not at all." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but another volley of shots decided the matter. They broke cover simultaneously, running in a crouch across the open ground as bullets whined around them like angry hornets. Margaret felt one tug at her skirt, another chipstone from the boulder beside her head, but somehow they reached the new position intact. From their new vantage point, she could see one of the gunmen clearly, a lean man in a dark coat working his way up the slope toward their previous position. He moved with military precision, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning for targets. Margaret raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel as Sam had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, and her shot went wide. But the gunman dove for cover with a startled curse. She'd missed, but she'd also announced that they weren't helpless prey anymore. "Good," Sam called out, firing his own rifle at a muzzle flash among the trees. "Keep them honest." The battle settled into a deadly game of move and countermove, with both sides seeking advantage among the rocks and ravines of the mountainside. Margaret quickly discovered that actually hitting targets was far more difficult than the dime novels made it seem. But she also learned that keeping the enemy's heads down was almost as valuable as killing them. As the sun climbed higher, the fight began to turn in their favor. The ambushers had counted on a quick kill, not a prolonged engagement, and their ammunition was finite. More importantly, they were city men unaccustomed to mountain warfare, while Sam had learned to fight in terrain like this during his time with the territorial militia. It was Margaret who spotted the flanking movement, 2 men working their way through a gully that would bring them up behind the boulder field. She pointed them out to Sam, who studied the terrain with tactical eyes. "If they get behind us, we're finished," he said grimly. "I have to stop them." "How?" Sam checked his ammunition, frowning at what he found. "I'm going down there. Face them in the open where they can't use cover against us." Margaret grabbed his arm. "That's suicide. It's the only chance we have." Sam's eyes met hers, and she saw the resolution there. "Margaret, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." She cut him off fiercely. "We're going down there together. You can't." "I can and I will." Margaret stood up, checking her own ammunition. She had 3 shots left, maybe 4. It would have to be enough. "I didn't come this far to lose you to hired killers." Sam stared at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. "All right, Mrs. Whitmore, let's go finish this." They left the shelter of the rocks together, walking down the mountainside with rifles ready and death waiting in the gully ahead. It should have been terrifying, but Margaret found herself strangely calm. She was exactly where she belonged, beside the man she'd married, fighting for the life they were building together. The 2 flanking gunmen emerged from the gully just as Sam and Margaret reached the open slope. For an instant, all 4 people stood frozen in the morning sunlight, measuring distances and calculating chances. Then the mountain exploded into gunfire. Margaret dropped to one knee and fired at the nearest gunman, her shot taking him in the chest and spinning him around like a child's toy. Sam's rifle boomed beside her, and the second man crumpled into the rocky soil. From the trees below came shouts of alarm and confusion. The remaining ambushers had realized their flanking force was gone, and suddenly, the hunted had become the hunters. "Come on," Sam said, reloading quickly. "Let's finish this before they regroup." They advanced down the slope together, moving from cover to cover with the patient precision of people who understood that rushing meant dying. The remaining gunmen tried to break and run, but Sam's knowledge of the terrain allowed him to anticipate. Their movement stopped. The fight ended when the last shooter, a young man barely out of his teens, threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "I surrender." Sam approached cautiously, his rifle trained on the boy. "Who sent you?" "Caldwell, the lawyer from Boston." The words tumbled out in a rush. "He paid us $50 each to make sure you never reached Helena. Said it had to look like an accident, road agents or Indians or something." Margaret felt sick. $50 more money than most people saw in months to commit murder. The casual way these men valued human life made her understand why Sam had been so determined to fight rather than negotiate. "Where is Caldwell now?" Sam demanded. "Copper Ridge, waiting at the hotel like he told you." The boy was shaking now, perhaps realizing how close he'd come to dying on this desolate mountainside. "Please, mister, I got a family. You should have thought of that before you took money to kill innocent people," Sam said coldly. "But I'm not an executioner. Strip off your gun belt and start walking. If I see you again, anywhere in this territory, I'll finish what you started here." The boy scrambled to obey, disappearing into the forest with desperate haste. Sam watched him go, then turned to check on Margaret. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his earlier coldness replaced by gentle concern. "No." Margaret looked down at the Winchester in her hands, hardly believing she'd actually used it. "I killed a man." You defended your life and your husband's life, Sam corrected firmly. There's a difference. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. The reality of what had just happened would probably hit her later, when the adrenaline faded and she had time to think. For now, she was grateful to be alive. What do we do now? She asked. Sam looked toward Helena, visible in the valley below. Now we go see Judge Mackenzie. Caldwell just made a fatal mistake. He tried to solve his problem with murder instead of law. That changes everything. They remounted their horses and continued down the mountain, leaving the bodies of the ambushers behind for the ravens and the wolves. Margaret rode in silence, processing what had just occurred. She'd killed a man. She'd stood and fought instead of running. She'd chosen to face death beside her husband, rather than fleeing to safety. Most shocking of all, she didn't regret any of it. By the time they reached Helena's outskirts, Margaret had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. She was done being a victim. She was done letting other people's greed and violence dictate her life. Jonathan Caldwell had made the mistake of underestimating Margaret Whitmore. When they returned to Copper Ridge, he was going to discover just how costly that error would prove to be. But first, they had an honest judge to visit. And if Sam was right about Mackenzie, Caldwell's legal threats were about to become significantly less intimidating. The war for her freedom was far from over. But for the first time since leaving Boston, Margaret felt like she might actually win. Judge William Mackenzie was a bear of a man with silver whiskers and eyes like winter steel, and he listened to their story with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from lies. His office in Helena's territorial courthouse was spartanly furnished but immaculately organized, reflecting a mind that valued substance over appearance. "Let me understand this correctly," Mackenzie said after Sam finished recounting Caldwell's threats and the morning's ambush. "This Boston attorney is claiming a $400 debt, gives him the right to seize property worth 10 times that amount?" "That's exactly what he's claiming," Margaret confirmed, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her. "Bones. He has legal documents, stamps, everything that looks official." Mackenzie examined the papers Caldwell had left with them, his weathered face growing darker with each page. "Forgeries," he said finally. "Skillful ones, but forgeries nonetheless. This seal is from the Massachusetts Superior Court, but the case numbers don't match their filing system. More importantly, territorial law doesn't recognize inherited debt beyond the estate's actual assets." Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully she nearly collapsed. "So the debt isn't valid?" "Oh, the debt might be real enough," Mackenzie clarified. "But even if your father owed this money, creditors can't pursue you personally for it. They can claim against whatever estate he left behind, but since you've testified he died with nothing but debts, they have no legal recourse against you whatsoever." Sam leaned forward in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged shoulder. "What about the attempted murder? We have a witness who'll testify that Caldwell hired those gunmen." Mackenzie's smile was sharp as a cavalry saber. "Now that Mr. Whitmore is where things get interesting. Attempted murder is a territorial crime, which means it falls under my jurisdiction. And unlike some of my colleagues, I don't believe justice should be for sale to the highest bidder." Within an hour, Mackenzie had drafted arrest warrants for Jonathan Caldwell and his associates, charging them with conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, and fraud. More importantly, he'd agreed to accompany them back to Copper Ridge personally, bringing with him 2 territorial marshals and enough legal authority to cut through any local corruption. "It's time someone reminded these eastern criminals that Montana Territory has its own laws," Mackenzie declared as they prepared to depart. "And those laws protect honest citizens from precisely this kind of exploitation." The ride back to Copper Ridge took the better part of 2 days, but this time they traveled with an escort that would give any potential ambushers serious pause. Margaret found herself watching Sam carefully as they rode, noting how he favored his wounded shoulder and the lines of pain around his eyes. He'd refused to rest longer in Helena, insisting they needed to get back before Caldwell decided to take more direct action against their friends and neighbors. As if reading her thoughts, Sam caught her watching him and managed a tired smile. "I'll be fine, Margaret. It's just a flesh wound. Just a flesh wound that could have killed you if it had been 2 inches to the right," she replied tartly. "You're not invincible, Sam Whitmore, no matter what you think." "No," he agreed quietly. "But I'm stubborn enough to make up for it." They reached Copper Ridge as the sun was setting on their 3rd day away, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that took Margaret's breath away. The little town looked exactly as they'd left it, but somehow felt different to her eyes. This was home now, in a way Boston had never been. This was the place where she'd found not just safety, but belonging. Caldwell and his men were still at the hotel, apparently confident that their hired killers had solved their problem permanently. Margaret felt a grim satisfaction as Marshal Davies and his deputy surrounded the building while Judge Mackenzie strode through the front door with Sam and Margaret flanking him. They found Caldwell in the hotel's small dining room, enjoying what looked like an expensive bottle of wine while reviewing legal documents. Sullivan and 2 other men sat at nearby tables, their positions chosen to watch the exits and intimidate other guests. All of them looked up with varying degrees of surprise as the judge's party entered. "Jonathan Caldwell," Mackenzie announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, and fraud." Caldwell's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, calculation, and finally resigned anger. He set down his wineglass with deliberate care and studied Mackenzie's badge with the eye of a man who understood exactly what authority it represented. "This is highly irregular," Caldwell said smoothly. "I'm here on legitimate business, properly documented and entirely legal. If Mrs. Whitmore has made accusations, Mrs. Whitmore has made accusations," Mackenzie interrupted, "and she has witnesses to support them, including one of the gunmen you hired to murder her and her husband on the Helena Road." For the first time since Margaret had met him, Caldwell looked genuinely shaken. His pale eyes flicked to Sullivan, who was already tensing for action, then back to the judge's implacable face. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Caldwell began. "The only misunderstanding," Mackenzie replied, "was your belief that you could bring Eastern corruption into my territory without consequences. Marshal Davies, please place these men under arrest." What followed was brief but violent. Sullivan went for his gun, but Sam was faster despite his wounded shoulder. The crack of the Colt echoed through the dining room, and Sullivan pitched backward over his chair, clutching the shattered wrist. The other 2 gunmen surrendered immediately, apparently having learned wisdom from their companion's mistake. Caldwell himself made no resistance, perhaps understanding that his expensive suit and cultured manner wouldn't protect him from frontier justice. As the marshal's handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he fixed Margaret with a stare full of impotent fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "My clients have long memories and longer reach than you can possibly imagine." Margaret stepped forward, close enough to see the fear hiding beneath his arrogance. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd discovered what she was truly capable of. "Your clients can come whenever they like," she said. "They'll find that Margaret Whitmore is not the frightened girl who fled Boston. And if they make the same mistake you did, underestimating what people will do to protect their families, they'll end up the same way you have." Caldwell's composure finally cracked. "You killed 3 of my men." "I defended my home and my husband," Margaret corrected. "And I'll do it again if necessary. The difference is, next time I won't lose any sleep over it." As the prisoners were led away to await transport to the territorial prison, Elena Rodriguez approached with tears in her eyes. "Margaret, Sam, thank God you're safe. When you disappeared, and then those men started asking questions about you." "It's over now," Margaret assured her, accepting the older woman's fierce embrace. They can't hurt anyone anymore. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they weren't entirely true. Caldwell's arrest would send a message back to Boston, but it wouldn't eliminate the criminal network that had spawned him. There would be others someday who might try to claim what Patrick Collins had owed. The difference was that now Margaret was ready for them. The celebration that night was subdued but heartfelt. Word of Caldwell's arrest had spread quickly through Copper Ridge, and people who'd been afraid to speak openly against corruption suddenly found their voices. Frank Henderson, still sporting bandages from Morrison's attack, raised a toast to folks who stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Margaret found herself the center of attention in a way that would have terrified her weeks ago. Now she accepted the congratulations and gratitude with quiet grace, understanding that she'd become something she'd never expected, a symbol of resistance against the forces that preyed on honest people. Late that evening, she and Sam sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The events of the past days seemed almost dreamlike now, but the bandage on Sam's shoulder and the Winchester leaning against the rail served as reminders that the threat had been all too real. "I got a letter from Emma today," Margaret said, pulling the envelope from her apron pocket. "She heard about my marriage from someone at the post office who'd seen the announcement in the territorial newspaper." Sam straightened with interest. "What did she say?" "She's happy for me. Says she always knew I'd find my way to something better." Margaret smiled, reading the familiar handwriting. "She also said she's been saving money, hoping to come west herself. Apparently, Boston's losing its appeal." "There's plenty of room here," Sam said quietly, "and plenty of work for someone willing to learn." Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude and something deeper, the kind of love that grew slowly but lasted forever. She'd like that. We both would. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. Finally, Sam spoke the words that had been building between them for days. "Margaret, I need you to know something. This marriage started as duty, as honor to my brother's memory. But somewhere along the way, it became real for me. You became real for me." Margaret turned to face him, seeing her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I know, it became real for me too. I love you," Sam said simply. "Not as Thomas's intended bride, not as a responsibility I inherited. I love you as Margaret Whitmore, the woman who stood beside me against killers and corruption, who chose to fight rather than run, and I love you," Margaret replied, the words feeling like a benediction. "Sam Whitmore, who gave a stranger his name and protection, who kept every promise even when it put him in mortal danger. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the formal peck of duty he'd given her at their wedding. It was the kiss of a man, claiming his wife, of a woman welcoming her husband home. It spoke of battles fought together and victories shared, of a future built on foundations stronger than law or custom. As autumn deepened into winter, that future began to take shape. Emma arrived in November, wide-eyed with wonder at the vast spaces and clean air of Montana Territory. She adapted to ranch life with the same determination that had carried Margaret through her own transformation, and soon proved invaluable in managing the expanded household. Wade Morrison was arrested for cattle rustling the following spring, after Judge McKenzie's investigation uncovered evidence linking him to Thomas's murder. With Morrison gone and Caldwell's network exposed, Copper Ridge began to flourish as honest people found the courage to stand up for themselves. The railroad came through as planned, bringing prosperity and growth to the territory. The Whitmore Ranch expanded, adding new buildings and new cattle, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. But success hadn't changed. The fundamental character of the place Thomas had envisioned. It remained a home where family mattered more than profit, where neighbors helped neighbors, where justice meant something. On their first wedding anniversary, Margaret and Sam stood together in the same church where they'd spoken their vows, renewing promises that had begun in duty but had transformed into devotion. Reverend Patterson smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife once again, this time with the full knowledge of what those words truly meant. "You know," Margaret said as they walked home through the spring evening, "I used to think that love was something that happened to you, like lightning or disease, something beyond your control. And now?" Sam asked, his arm around her waist, as they paused to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire. "Now I know better. Love is something you choose, every day, with every action. It's not about falling, it's about standing up together, no matter what tries to knock you down." Sam smiled and pulled her closer. "Sounds about right to me, Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore." The name had become as natural as breathing, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She was no longer the desperate girl who'd fled Boston with nothing but hope and determination. She was a rancher's wife, a fighter, a woman who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories began not with passion, but with the simple decision to honor a promise to a dead man. As they reached their porch, Margaret paused to look back at the road that had brought Caldwell and his threats to their door. Somewhere back east, other desperate people were probably making the same choice she'd made, leaving everything behind for the chance at something better. She hoped they'd find what she'd found in Montana territory, not just safety or security, but the opportunity to discover who they really were when tested by adversity. She hoped they'd learn, as she had, that sometimes the best things in life came not from the plans you made, but from the courage to embrace the unexpected. The frontier had a way of revealing people's true character, stripping away pretense and social expectations to show what lay beneath. In Margaret's case, it had revealed strength she'd never known she possessed, love she'd never thought she deserved, and a future brighter than any she'd dared to imagine. As she and Sam entered their home together, Margaret offered a silent prayer of gratitude to Thomas Whitmore, whose dreams had made it all possible. He'd never met the woman he'd planned to marry, but his vision of love and partnership had created something even more precious, a foundation strong enough to build a lifetime on. The mail-order bride who'd arrived to find her groom dead had discovered something far more valuable than the security she'd sought. She'd found herself, and in doing so, had found a love that would last forever. Outside, the Montana wind sang through the grass like a lullaby, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whitmore began the rest of their lives together, grateful for the journey that had brought them home to each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.